do you sort of enjoy, I think we mentioned a little bit before about, the end-to-end process. So when something is done, that sort of dopamine hit you get and you're like, yes, I did that. Is that something, is that, you know what I'm talking about? You're laughing,
Yeah.
you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Definitely not an ego thing at all. Not at all.
Welcome back to episode 10. That's right, you're 10 of the Data Strategist podcast. Who knew we'd be doing this for this long? Today's guest is Rachel Cunningham. She is a data engineer and she's had a really great career, and she lives on a boat, which is pretty awesome as well. So she has a career that spans from sports psychology, statistics to now data engineering. And today's podcast is really about, why did you choose data engineering? What's the best thing about being a data engineer? Sort of, what's the biggest challenge? And then we go into sort of, will AI change the role of a data engineer? And then finally, something that we always talk about in this podcast, and that is data ethics and AI, and how we as data professionals need to be vocal about that, and conversation starts to happen at data engineer, data scientist, data analyst level. Really great podcast. I thank Rachel for coming on, because it was really nice to meet her. And yeah, it's just a blast. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much. So thanks for joining us on the Data Strategist podcast. Today's guest is Rachel, but I'm not going to introduce you. You might as well do it yourself. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep, sure, no worries. So my name's Rachel Cunningham. Been working as a data engineer for just under 2 years now, with quite a varied career history before then, but I'm sure we'll get to that as well. And yeah, fun fact, I live on a sailboat. So there we go.
That is a very fun fact. Okay, so yeah, let's just jump straight into sort of your career to date. So how did you end up becoming a data engineer? What did you do before it? Tell everyone a bit about your journey.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if you saw my CV, I think some people would think I made it up. But I spent a large portion of my career in academia. That was my general trajectory, was to be an academic, mainly in the area of sports psychology. But did a lot in the way of psychometric testing, obviously in research and analysis as well. Then developed this keen interest in the logic and the mathematics behind all of the testing that I was doing. And it, in essence, it started off because it helped me make sense of the testing, as opposed to just putting in some numbers into like a software program. So yeah, so learning about the background of that, and then decided actually I quite like this whole statistics thing. And yeah, so decided to leave academia, ended up in government, interestingly kind of swung the other way. And yeah, worked as a statistician, mainly during COVID times as well. So got thrown right into public COVID health analysis, which was interesting times. Started doing a bit of work using R in that role. Always had been a bit of a hobbyist with programming languages. Did some like Rails Girls weekends previously, and just sort of built some apps and programs on the side. But yeah, decided to formalize that experience a little bit. And fortunately enough, managed to land a place on the Code First Girls Nano degree, which is a really good program, which is sponsored by various companies. And you have a guaranteed job at the end. So it's obviously a great foot in the door opportunity. Because I'm sure you'll be aware, one of the biggest challenges is just landing that first role to really, gain the experience. So yes, that was basically where my data engineering career started formally. Worked at the bank for a while, got a really good grounding, and I guess really intense governance processes and all of that good stuff. But then felt maybe it was time to diversify my experience a little bit. As you can imagine, bank, huge organization, part of a really niche part of one process. So felt let's get more experience in doing different parts of what a data engineer would typically do, just from a professional development perspective as well. So then, yeah, ended up at a startup, which is, again, a completely different environment, very fast paced, but also somewhere that I had a lot of autonomy and creativity to really drive things forward. So was involved in the full build of the platform, the data platform, and yeah, basically developing any kind of documentation, governance, security, and wearing many, many hats. And then that's basically where I am today. So that is the whistle-stop tour of my career history.
That was a literal whistle-stop. I think it's fascinating that you went from sort of psychology to statistics to now to engineering. What made you change between statistics to engineering? Well, I guess let's go back first of all, from psychology to statistics. Was it just that keen interest that really drove that?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things. I think that what I learned during my time of doing research is fundamentally at the base of everything, I'm a curious person, and everything I do is driven by that curiosity. And obviously, something that's quite inherent in engineering and development is the ability to problem solve, to investigate, to research, to teach yourself a lot of things too. So I guess there was a desire to apply more of that problem solving mindset to things, to real life, real world problems too. In academia, in sports psychology, to some extent, you can have an impact on individuals, but it's slow. It's super slow because obviously research takes time, and the results tend to move things forward super incrementally. And I guess there was just that sense that I wasn't really having a massive impact on the people that I really set out to help in the first place. So moving into a role that had a direct connection in terms of the output on improving people's lives, informing decisions, it made sense. It just made sense to really try and have a greater sense of purpose in that way and not just be more on the theoretical side of things too.
I think that's kind of the natural progression for people, though, is when we start out our career, it's all about gaining that experience. But once you've got the experience, it's more about, is it meaningful what I do? And I think that's a moment in time for most people's careers, try to work out, can I actually make a real impact here? Or am I just another cog in the machine? And there's a definite mind switch. But what about when you've done your statistical analysis and area of work, that move into data engineering, was that led by the course you were doing or the degree you were doing, or was it a conscious decision to move into data engineering?
I would definitely say it was a conscious decision. So the work I was doing as a statistician felt sort of limited from the perspective that I was delivering analytics, but I was really only touching the surface of what that information held, where it came from, how to improve it, how to get richer sources of information. And I guess I felt like I wanted to understand the background process to how that information is collected. How do we make it valuable, meaningful? And I think that was largely influenced by my time in academia because there's so much rigor and so much red tape, I suppose, that goes into research that I've always got that mindset. And so I think that's what really kind of drove me to decide, okay, let's formalize this. And then also, again, I think just doing the hobbyist projects on the side, really discovering that actually I quite like this logic thing. And there's always a neat process, I think, with development work as well, where when you have an outcome, so when you develop something, it works, you're like instant gratification. It's nice, right? It's a nice feeling. So there was partly that too, I guess. But the course sort of helped to just solidify that decision in my head, that was the right next steps for me, really.
Yeah, I think if you are a problem solver and you enjoy coding, data engineering lends itself to that because you have a problem to solve, moving data from A to B at a you can always improve that process. You can always look for a new tool. There is definitely more of a logical pathway for data engineers. When you take someone like an analyst, they would hypothesize and then come up with a sort of route of maybe this is the right way, maybe it's more of an exploration, not
Yeah.
necessarily a logical path. So I think they're the two definitions. Same with data scientists; they kind of hypothesize and come up with sort of the approach and multiple approaches, whereas data engineering is very much a process-driven, logical thought on how to achieve something. So it's definitely two mindsets, and that's fascinating. You've gone from statistics, which is kind of more of that exploration approach, to more
Yeah.
of a logical, defined thought process, which is it's quite interesting to see that people don't necessarily just become a data engineer. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start as that, and I'm going to be that. And you've gone through this career of you started out as sports psychology, realized data is kind of key to that, and then kind of built this entire career on becoming a data engineer. The fascinating bit I would like to ask you about is the feeling between academia or banking sector regulated and then moving from that into a startup, whereas minimal regulation, I would say, for a startup, because you are trying to break boundaries, and then also the freedom of expression and the multiple hats. How did you cope with that? Because most people struggle with that when they move the other way, but also, it's a big challenge, right? When you move across.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's a few things. I think that throughout my life, I've sort of been described as 100 miles an hour. So I I juggle many things at once. I'm sort of, I work through things really quickly. Um, it's not in the same sense as chaos, but it's that sense of needing that level of like stimulation and activity to feel
Mm,
productive. And I really think that a startup environment and startup culture really feeds into that really well, because
definitely does.
your work is never really done, and it evolves really quickly. You have to be responsive, but you also have to preempt a lot of things. And I don't know, this maybe is reducing it a little bit, but in some ways it feels like a game. So it's like, you have to be prepared ultimately for the unknown, but
Yeah.
then you also have to just be really flexible and be able to move quickly, make decisions quickly. And I guess I like that challenge. Like it's maybe a it's maybe a bit of a glutton for punishment situation, but I do
I think
like
people are
that.
more. I think there's definitely a different culture as well, though. Like if you think of startups, it does feel like you're all in it together. There isn't sort of that hierarchy or bureaucracy in anybody's way. You are part of one machine, and you are making a difference to what you do. So when you talk about it being more like a game, I kind of understand that a little bit, because it is kind of like it's us against the world type
Sure.
approach, and you've got to try and really generate something really quickly, and you kind of everyone's pulling the same way. Whereas when you've got larger organizations, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're all pulling the same way. You're kind of all you've got your own sort of processes, and like you said, you're a small part of a bigger wheel.
Yeah.
It doesn't. You don't feel like you can steer the boat in any way. You've got to ride along with a company like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think that's a really good point. I would definitely say that of my current company, that there is a shared sense of purpose, regardless of whatever your skills and expertise is. Everyone is there for the same reason, and you're
Mm,
100% right. It's a different feeling. It's maybe driven by the fact that there's also a sense of there is an opportunity to influence something. So in larger organizations, everything's fairly well established. It's quite well defined in terms of, even if we're talking about like the baseline tech stack that they use and things like that. Whereas
mm.
in a startup, you have an opportunity to say, oh, look, there's this new tool that's come out, or here's what the latest people are saying about how we evolve our data stack, and let's look at that, let's try it out. And there's just a lot more opportunity to not only learn, but be flexible in that too. And I think that's pretty key in any technology role, really. But data engineering is evolving so quickly that I think if you get stuck in just sticking to like this one approach or tech stack, that you risk getting left behind and then maybe having to do some legwork in the future that then helps you transfer all that stuff to somewhere else, etc. So
you will carry a higher technical debt if you don't evolve with the times, and then that becomes much more of a challenge to change, and then it becomes a huge project that no one wants to touch and no one wants to talk about or do because it's too difficult, and everything we've done before will break. So there's definitely that mentality of let's just keep evolving. Quick evolvement helps. That's not saying that large companies are bad to work in, because they offer a sense of stability. I think what startups do have is that volatility of, if this doesn't succeed, then there has to be consequences of not succeeding. Where that's the playoff that you've got when you go for a startup. So I think, I don't want to put down large organizations too much because they do serve a purpose, but I think there's definitely that trade-off between the two.
Yeah, 100%. And it is about weighing up that risk as well. Obviously, I'm in a slightly more fortunate position that I don't have any dependents, and I don't have as many responsibilities. So there's there's a slight element of flexibility there too. But absolutely, I mean, I don't think that large organizations are necessarily bad. It's just a different experience for sure.
It's definitely a different experience. So can you tell me what's the best thing about data engineering?
Oh, that's a good question. So far for me, I would actually say it's the community. I've made more connections probably in the last 2 years with other data enthusiasts, shall we say, not just data engineers, but people who love data, than I would have said that I did when I was in academia.
Okay.
It's a different mindset, I think, in the way that people are. They're open to sharing, for starters, so they're open to sharing what they're doing, what they're learning. But everyone also is keen to learn, for the most part. And it is an exciting time for data engineering as well. Obviously, it's still kind of a new field in terms of the history of other technology roles, and I just really feel like I'm part of something bigger as opposed to just being part of a team or an organization. There is a wider sense of community and activity and things that I can get involved with. So
yeah, I think that plays a massive part into this whole ethos of being in data. It doesn't matter about what industry you're in. It doesn't matter about what company you work for. It matters about what you're doing in the area. So whether you're using the Apache suite of products, or whether you're, learning how to use Google Platform or Google Cloud, for example, or maybe you're going into Go, there's such a emphasis within this industry, the data industry, that people want to collaborate, because the problems you face, everyone else has probably faced exactly the same thing, and they're all trying to make it easier for each other rather than it being a us and them, which is it's a real difference to some industries. And there are bad practices and good practices, and we share them, and I think there's an acceptance of fail fast and fail together within the whole data sphere. I think that's a really important piece. But what about the job itself? Like, do you sort of enjoy, I think we mentioned a little bit before about, the end-to-end process. So when something is done, that sort of dopamine hit you get, and you're like, yes, I did that. Is that something, is that You know what I'm talking about. You're laughing.
Yeah.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Definitely not an ego thing at all. Not at all. But no, I think ultimately there's a sense of accomplishment when you, especially when it's something that has a wider impact for the business or facilitates making, someone else's role within the business easier, and you can do that, you can provide a solution to that. That's a great feeling. And I think it is, like I say, I love problem solving. Like, my mind is very primed for pattern recognition. That's just how I work. It's always been the case, even like solving puzzles or jigsaws or what, even down to that level, and so every time I get the opportunity to build something new like that, or to solve a new problem, or even to make something better, it's total instant gratification. Or maybe not instant, because let's be honest, it's not instant, the solution, is it? But it is a real sense of achievement. And I don't know if everyone gets that opportunity in other roles.
No, I think it's definitely a data specific feeling of when you produce a report or produce a pipeline that is different to the last one or more improved to the last one. So if you take, it's like in sport when you get a personal best. So if you run a query, it takes 10 minutes, but now you've done some more engineering on it and it takes 5. You're like, this is my new personal, and it's got that sort of euphoric feeling of, yeah, I did that on my own. No, I did that. And it's kind of that rush you get. And it's the same with analytics and scientists. When you find that nugget of information that no one else could find, you get that boom feeling. I can't describe it. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
It's a total euphoric feeling. I don't really know how many jobs have that, but it's definitely more. I've definitely experienced it more in data than I probably would have in tech as well. So
Okay.
it's a very different feeling. I think what you mentioned about sort of the data engineer role being new, I think you're right as well. That is what's happened over the last, I don't know, 10, maybe 5, 10 years, is that these roles used to be one. So you used to have an analyst, an engineer, a scientist, a DBA, or you're just a data person and you got to do everything. And now these roles have split out into engineering, analyst, and scientist, and really honed in on focusing on those skills. Because like we said before, they have all got these different sort of mentalities to them. And that's really important for people to understand. So my next question to you is, we've talked about what was good about being a data engineer. What is the biggest challenge about being a data engineer? Because it's not all glue. It's not all groovy.
It's not.
There's definitely challenges in this job. It's good to talk about them.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. So the first thing that comes to mind really is something that maybe I already said was a positive, is that because things are evolving so rapidly in some areas, it can be difficult sometimes to keep up. And I still think, to some extent, data engineers are expected to do a lot in terms of responsibilities and areas of work to cover. And there's a lot that you want to, like, what you want to achieve, what should be done, but at the same time, your sense of resource and the time that you can apply to something are not relative to those expectations. And I think sometimes there's a bit of an incongruence between what you want something to look like and how much time you need to get to that place. And
is that from more sort of like product managers and the businesses asking for the resource, or is it from other, or is it yourself thinking it like that?
I think it's more of a self thing. Maybe it's a personality trait. I'm not sure, but it's, let me try and describe it in a better way. So it's that sense of, I guess, your self expectation, because maybe you have experience of from academia, of building projects, for for planning projects, for having targets set and things like that. And then ultimately along the way, there's always blockers when it comes to engineering. There's always dependencies that sometimes slow a process. And there's just ultimately things that lie outside of your control. And there's that sort of frustration between, you're really eager to get somewhere, but you're having to then manage this external dependency, or to have to try and pull something back because you're blocked for whatever reason. And I think it's hard sometimes to be motivated to get to an end point but feel like you can't get there. And I don't know to what extent you've experienced this, but to some extent there isn't yet a really well-defined shared understanding of what good data looks like within an organization. Sometimes it's maybe certain individuals have a good perspective, but for things to work well together, I think it's really important that people at least have an awareness and appreciation, especially if you build a product and you don't have any appreciation for the data or the output. It's potentially not going to be very easy to derive value from it. So I guess there's a bit of that. And maybe that's a time culture thing. I'm not sure. But
I think data literacy across different industries, across different people, that is a big challenge for data people in general. Because if people don't understand that they put rubbish in, they're going to get a rubbish response out. People say it a lot. I've heard it a lot throughout my career that, oh yeah, we know if you put bad data in, you get bad data out. But knowing that as someone who should be inputting that information is very different than everybody else talking about it. And I think, when engineers, not data engineers, but software engineers build products, data is not usually the forefront of what they're thinking about. They're thinking functionality, they're thinking UX, they're thinking, I've seen people build things in the client rather than actually have a database because it was quicker for the engineer, the software engineer, to pass data around. But they didn't realize that actually cripples a whole process off the back of it. So I think you're right. There's definitely a big challenge when it comes to other areas.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's definitely it's no fault of their own, whoever the software engineer or whoever else is involved in that process. And I think there's some kind of education piece or knowledge piece that has to happen that brings data engineers maybe closer to those who are building the products in some way. I guess some organizations probably do it really well, others not so well, but some kind of more or greater shared understanding, shared working when it comes to building these things.
I think one of the common things is when they change field names for no reason. That's one that catches out data engineers all the time. It's like, oh yeah, well, we don't use that field anymore, or we just changed the naming convention of it. No problem.
Randomly delete things. Yeah.
There you go. Right now we're getting to the crux of the issue. Is that we blame software engineers for all our problems. That's usually what happens. I think the collaboration between the two probably does need to be closer, but there also needs to be a level of mutual respect, I guess, between the two. So the software engineer doesn't understand data as well as a data engineer, but then a data engineer doesn't understand how to build software. So
100%.
there needs to be there is sometimes that us and them mentality between data and software, and they need to break down that barrier that you all work at the same place or you're all trying to do the same thing. And that's difficult because what I find is there's not that mutual respect of each other's roles. That doesn't happen. We may have an appreciation, but there's a level of respect between the two, because software engineers may go, oh, well, I actually like Java. And then data engineers, well, I like Python. Oh, well, no, Java's, but it kind of creates that us and them straight off the bat. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge. I think, that's a tough one to deal with. I think most companies now are starting to build sort of squads.
Yeah.
and multidisciplinary teams. So you'd have a data engineer, a software engineer, front end, back end, a data analyst in there, and a product owner, scrum master type squads that deal with feature specific stuff. So you can have that challenge. It's when you have separate organizations and separate departments that don't want to align to some sort of multidisciplinary team. That's when it kind of struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you experience it like this, but there is, I mean, data is a buzzword, you know, everybody wants data, love data.
Yeah.
It's got so much value, give it to us right now. But then there's a massive disconnect between what that means for us as engineers and what they sort of expect in the delivery of that too. And I do think it's a kind of, it's a mindset thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a knowledge thing. I think it will come with time, but I think there's definitely some work to be done.
I think there is a disconnect, but I think it's more, I'm not sure whether it's disconnect actually. I think it's probably more wanting control of it. So what I mean by that is, as data people, we have a beginning and an end to most of our processes and the way that we do things. So if we build a report, if we build a pipeline, or we build an algorithm, there is a beginning and an end to that process, and then an evolution that moves further on. And we can show off those skill sets quite easily. When you're doing back-end software development, nobody will see it. Nobody will have the impact or understand that this is a really well-built product. They just see the nice button you click at the front. You don't have that. You have that disconnect yourself. And then when you get into sort of leadership and management, data is kind of the place to be, because everybody wants it. Everybody wants to control it, and everybody wants to manage that. Not only manage the team, but manage the narrative that comes out of data.
Yeah.
And usually the way that I like to operate, and in most data leaders like to operate, is we are Switzerland. We are not here for the politics. We're not here for, we are neutral. We are neutral to the company, and we offer a value-based approach to everything. And we're not here to tell you if it's good. We're here to tell you what's happening. And that's how we should act as data people, independent functions. That we're like internal auditors, but friendly. Right? That's how we are.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of something that happens a lot within the data sphere. But
it definitely is a subtlety. Like it's very subtle, that difference. But yeah, 100% understand and agree.
So you've been in data engineering now for a couple of years. The next phase that we're going through is all about AI. And we're on sort of that preface of where we had, when the internet came in, there was a massive technology boom, and then social media was born. All these boom, 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 we kind of went up on a technology spike. We're now on the preface of another spike with AI. And I'd just like to know your thoughts around, how will AI impact the role of a data engineer? Is it a help or is it a hindrance? Is probably where we're going to go with this.
Yeah, it's definitely a very popular topic at the moment. I remember when ChatGPT first became publicly available, and everyone started sending me a ton of stuff like this will change your life, you know. Obviously with my background in statistics, etc., and understanding the large language model behind things like that and how they work, what information feeds them, and then, you know, you have to have a bit of a balanced perspective about what they can really deliver on. But in terms of the data engineering role, from my perspective, there's a ton of potential time you could save by using some of these tools, and not necessarily to write the code for you. I mean, I don't think that we're there yet. But I think in terms of making things quicker, so if you require like the syntax for something, or you just need to formulate an understanding of a new area quickly, rather than sitting there, sifting through a bunch of dead ends and finally finding that bit of
Reddit
information.
posts. essentially.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. Hours of YouTube no longer required, kind of thing. I think there's definitely a benefit to be had there in terms of velocity, in terms of delivery and time of delivery. If anything can make my life easier, then that's always a good thing. But I think with the understanding and the caveat that it's only good as the information that you feed it. And so at the end of the day, if you don't know how to ask the right questions, you're not going to get good answers.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me anyway, that's where I'm not sort of fearful that it's somehow going to replace me as a data engineer, because at the end of the day, it's still built by humans for now. There are such things as genetic algorithms, and they can learn as they run through a process. That's not a new thing. That's been around for a long time. But ultimately, to me anyway, they're just another tool in my toolbox, in the same way that an IDE now tells me that with this red squiggly line that I've missed something. That's how I view it. That's how I see it. That's how I plan to use it.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of scaremongering in the media, isn't there? Where it's going to take our jobs. It's going to displace people. Now, I don't disagree that it will displace people, but what it'll mean is that people using AI will be more efficient. So they may automate certain processes that people do manually now. That's all this means. This is just going to speed up the sort of the automation of manual tasks. That's what this will do. I don't think it's going to, turn into some supercomputer and start, killing everybody. That's not the case, right? We don't have that ability yet. Maybe one day, I could be wrong. We could be sat here, hiding from the robots. This is like an underground radio show now. But
never say never,
Yeah, I think I'll never say never, but I don't think there's that approach yet. I think it is more of a let's use it, and that's the mentality of all data people that I've spoken to. I don't think there's many that go, yeah, it's going to kill us all. But everyone does say it's going to improve everything that we do, and velocity is the first time I've heard velocity, but that is a key aspect of it, and it's not just it'll increase the velocity that we have as data professionals to automate other areas of manual intervention or application. So there will be displacement, but not necessarily because of AI, but because data people or software engineers or whoever are more efficient. And that will be the change I think we see. But that's really interesting. I appreciate your thought on that. And as we're sort of talking about AI specifically, one thing that we do have to be aware of as data people is more of the ethics that sit behind AI. So, when we build something, are we building it for the right reasons? Are we building it correctly? Is there a real reason behind what we're doing? Or is it pure monetary value? Does it have harm to the world because we're doing it? We're essentially the people building it, right? We're not the people making the money, but we're the people building these things. So data ethics plays a massive part in our role. I was just wondering, what's your thoughts on that sort of space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess coming from a background of psychology, ethics was deeply ingrained in me from like the age of 21. When you went through massive sort of ethical submissions before you could ever carry out any kind of research or project or anything like that. And at the forefront of that, actually, the forefront of any ethics in psychology and any of those disciplines is do no harm. And so I guess I lead with that always in mind. We're humans, we're not perfect. But I think if we can apply a rigorous process of risk assessment, of considering even things like downstream impacts of these things, I think that's really key. And I think also bearing in mind that you don't want to simply use people's information to, beat your competitor, for example, if that's somehow a detriment to your customer, because at the end of the day, loyalty matters as well. So if you do something that's underhand or collect some information that you shouldn't be doing, I think in the end it never ends well.
Mm.
But I do think that, and not to create a bunch of red tape, but I do think that there maybe has to be at least some kind of shared best practice developed around using AI in relation to data. Because I think people have different levels of understanding of what that looks like, and I think it'd be important to establish maybe a clearer idea. Maybe even, take some of the ideas of these professions that work with, because ultimately it's an area of vulnerability. I mean, you can tap into areas of vulnerability, can't you, with data? I
Mm.
mean, so when you work in psychology, you tend to work with vulnerable people, and there's an appreciation that you're in a position of power and you don't take advantage of that. And I don't think it's so dissimilar from this, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right. I never really thought of it that way. I think that's a really hard thing to manage, though,
Hmm.
because with psychology, you have a direct connection with somebody or a relatively direct connection.
Yep.
With data, you are removed from that. You are removed from that physical presence of someone. You see that person as an ID. You don't see that person as a name and address. That you see them as customer ID number. This is what this
Yep.
customer did. You kind of have that um, removal of the real world.
Sure.
I don't know how you would regulate it or create a shared best practice, because if you think about you worked in the banking industry, the data they would use there has quite large impacts on people's lives. Whether that's the best way or the wrong way to do it, I don't know. When you talk about raising interest rates, how much profit can you make from certain percentage, that sort of stuff should play into that sort of ethical remit. But how do you regulate that compared to someone in a startup or someone on their own sort of
Sure.
starting up on their own? I'm not sure how you can have this shared endeavor when your ultimate goals are different.
Hmm.
So a bank will be focused on profit,
Yeah.
whereas where I work now, we're focused on people outcomes. Our motives are completely different to what we do. So a shared
Yeah.
endeavor will not really work.
No, and it's a really good point, actually. I guess it's definitely a bit of an unknown as well,
Mm,
because I think it's like a lot of things. Probably we won't try to regulate it until someone does something really bad, and then they'll have
when
to
it's
bring
too
in
late.
something to mitigate that happening again.
Yeah.
Um, which is not my preferred approach, but typically that's how things go.
Mm,
Obviously, you've seen it in other industries such as the music industry or film industry, where they've included these AI things, and then it's people feel like it's either using their property, or it's taken away from whatever financial gain that they could have originally had from something. So I think until someone does something pretty bad, I don't think much will change. Um,
So do you when you think about these things, do you take a personal responsibility for it? So what I hear a lot of is, the corporations should focus on it, your big business should focus on it. And then there's kind of like, well, why did we build it in the first place? And as people who work in this industry, should we be the ones going, no, like should we be the ethical boundary, like starting point, the people who build it?
I mean, personally, from my perspective, I always try and put myself in the place of someone whose data is being collected.
Mm,
I'm probably more proactive than a lot of people in terms of making sure that companies aren't collecting information that I don't want them to hold and things like that. Um,
mm,
I don't know if that's because I've got the insight of being on the other side of that, of someone who handles data, and just how, like I say, how much really you are in a position of power. I definitely think personally, I always like to lead with integrity, and that's just because from a career perspective, from a professional perspective, I don't want to be in a position where I'm involved in something that, you know, ruins the rest of my my career, whatever. So there's always that in the back of my head, and I think I don't know if it's my history in the area of academia that I was in, but rigor and risk assessment and consideration are just things that I guess are part of my professional approach to something.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the responsibility should be placed on data engineers, because then what if something does go wrong? Then are we just simply going to be liable, and a company, you know, can sort of just say, oh well, it was them, wasn't us, kind of thing.
That is true. If you put the blame on the people who are doing the work, is that a reasonable excuse for people who are not doing the work but driving where the work goes? Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
I mean,
it's a
I think we need
conversation.
to. Yeah.
Oh, God, sorry.
I think we need to at least have an awareness of the ramifications of if we get it wrong. Because if we're at least aware of that, then I think that sort of encourages us to be a bit more careful with how we build things and what we use them for. And maybe to ask more questions about what something is being used for. But it's a difficult one, 100%. It's a difficult one. I think it's new territory as well for a lot of industries.
It really is new sort of territory for everybody, because I think what we've known in the data industry, or as data people, and people generally do know this, that Facebook, your Google, your YouTube, your Microsoft, they collect so much information on us that it'd be quite frightening. But people are willing to hand over that data because they receive Messenger, they receive Windows, they get this information. So I think it's a difficult balance between giving up your information, but then what do we do with that information in those companies, in any company we work in? I think the main thing is just to keep having this sort of conversation with people around data ethics, and just having, it may not need regulation, it just may need more people who are willing to talk about it, and at least have that conversation at design phase to go, what is the ultimate goal of doing this with the data? Is it profit? Is it helping somebody? Is it better customer satisfaction? Because if you're building something for customer satisfaction, brilliant. But if you're building something purely for profit that may have a detrimental impact on somebody, I don't know, maybe we should have that conversation there and then in the design phase. I think it is not necessarily on data engineers or data professionals, but it is definitely something that data professionals should talk about.
Yeah, 100%.
Have that debate.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, maybe it should be part of that initial design process, as opposed to a sort of consideration that comes afterwards.
Yeah. The day before, yeah, we're just going to release this. Did anyone think about that could kill people? No. I think it definitely needs to come a little bit earlier. Concept phase, design phase, whatever that is. And I think having data people around, or data professionals around, that have that ethical mindset will really drive that conversation. And that doesn't necessarily need to happen in the boardroom. That could happen in a squad or a sprint team or whatever we call it. I think that's where conversations can happen.
Yeah, exactly.
So, thank you very much for coming on today. I think we've covered off a hell of a lot. I think we've talked about everything. I don't think there's anything, no stone left unturned. But I think it's been absolutely brilliant having you on. So thank you for taking the time. And no, I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really interesting discussion as well. It's always
been great. And
good
thank you for watching the latest episode on the Data Strategist podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. They've been fantastic to do. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and watch the next video just over here. Thanks again. Speak to you again soon.